Humanities Council is that it's an excuse for me to take another road trip. And this was a great morning for a road trip. So I got to see yet another one of those beautiful Kansas skies just sort of opening up here in the Great Plains area. This is one of my favorite areas of Kansas because you've got this quiet beauty that other people just don't seem to appreciate, which means we have it all to ourselves. It's awesome. How many here have heard of a jackalope before? All right, so this is the wonderful thing about legends. Legends spread. And the program today is about some of those legends, how those legends grow, and some of those that you might not have heard of that started out about the same time as the legends that we are familiar with. The jackalope is one of my favorites, and in loving the road trip so much, I usually drive around in an embellished vehicle. I don't know if any of you parked in the north parking lot, but you might have noticed an embellished vehicle up that way. Has horns on the top, there's some horns for the Jeepalope itself, and in the center is Jack, a jackalope that kind of leads the way and looks out over this map of the United States that has roadside attractions sort of listed on it as my sort of wish list or way that I start tracking my own travels. So I always have used embellished vehicles for my own road trips, and those also lead to my ability to gather stories. Whenever I'm in a new place, I ask people what there is to see or do or hear, and that's how some of these lectures come to me, is that it's just a series of stories from the road. So in this one, we will be looking at just the fantastical ones. Not, I don't want to say they're not true, because this is the great part about legends. There's always a kernel of truth. Even if it's the most fabricated thing you've ever heard, there's normally a kernel of truth in every story that you hear. The problem is finding that kernel. But in this lecture, you'll find out that, for example, jackalopes are real. And I mean real in the real sense, not the sideshow sense. If you look at a sideshow banner, and it says alive, that does mean that whatever is behind that banner was alive the last time somebody checked. It's living, it's breathing. If it says real, it just means that there is a physical object behind that banner that you can touch. It might have been fabricated out of other parts, but it is, air quotes, real. So jackalopes are not only real, but they're also real, which is pretty awesome. So, since I've spent so much time saying jackalope, 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 let's get into that one. They actually have an origin point as far as the legend that you know about the jackalope. And most of us see it in this one familiar form, the mounted jackrabbit head with antlers. And the man responsible for popularizing this specific jackalope was Douglas Herrick from Jackson, Wyoming. And Douglas, Wyoming has now claimed to be the center of the jackalope. That is their, not just their totem animal, but because of Douglas Herrick's promotion of this wild game form, the city has erected this as their mascot. This is in front of the Chamber of Commerce. You can go and get a jackalope hunting license. That's usually good on February 29th and 30th. Signed, issued by Adam Lyer. And even in the licenses that they put forth, there are kernels of truth, but it's mostly about embellishing and making that legend even larger. In this particular license that I got whenever I went through about 10 years ago, it tells a little bit about why we don't see the jackalopes written up in our normal histories, and some of the omissions that led to its omission. When the song Home on the Range was written, it contained the phrase, where the deer and the antelope play with the jackrabbit. However, this offended the genteel ladies of that era, and the song was shortened to eliminate that sort of seedy underbelly of antelopes and jackrabbits copulating. Thus, the apparent origin of the jackalope was forever lost from Western folklore. Now, jackalope historians will tell you that jackalopes have beautiful high voices and are often mistaken for yodeling. So whenever the cowboys used to sing to their herds on the open range, sometimes they'd hear an echo, or what they assumed was an echo. It's actually the jackalope mimicking their song back to them and trying to lure them off to find those other cowboys. So the jackalope's always been this trickster spirit, and Douglas Herrick as I said, was the man who really started spreading this legend far and wide. And part of that was because of his ability to create taxidermy jackalopes. And he ended up creating his own origin story for where the jackalope came from. He said his grandfather used to tell tales of this great rare creature, and back in the 1920s, and he'd seen one in the 1920s. Well, Douglas and his brother were great hunters, and one day they came back with some jackrabbits, and they arrived too late to really process those jackrabbits, so they just threw them onto the workbench in the shed where they happened to have all of their hunting paraphernalia. When he came back out in the morning, that jackrabbit had sort of slid up against this pair of antlers that were also on the workbench. He looked at it and thought, that's exactly what Grandpa described seeing. So he mounted that jackrabbit with that set of horns, and that industry was born. Douglas Herrick ended up making thousands of these mounted jackalopes, again, retelling that story over and over again of his grandfather telling him about the jackalope and him just creating what his grandfather told him could be there. The town of Douglas, even their police cruisers have jackalopes on them. It's in every single bit of this town because Douglas Herrick brought so much attention to that area because of these legends. They decided that that really could be their totem animal. And the jackalope spread throughout the West. You can take a jackalope, if you have one mounted on your car, and you can go to Georgia, and people in Georgia know that this is an emblem of the Southwest. That legend has spread so much and so far, sometimes through exaggerated postcards which are still produced, but also through those legends. It is such an important part of that story of the West that when Douglas Herrick died, he actually got a 4-column obituary in the New York Times. That's a pretty big deal. I mean, a New York Times mention is pretty awesome anyway, but this is 4 columns in the New York Times that tell his origin story of the jackalope, how the jackalope really influenced Douglas, Wyoming, and his contribution to basically the lore of the West. Now this is the weird part. This is where, I mean, there's been a lot of kernels of truth in this. He did mount the first stuffed jackalope that we know of today, and that really spread like wildfire. But naturalists, very early on, when they started exploring the Americas, were telling tales of horned rabbits. So they do come up in those early drawings of flora and fauna of this continent. And they really did believe that horned rabbits existed. And while I was doing research on this, I found out that they really do. Not in taxidermy form, but there are actual live rabbits that exist with horns. There is a taxidermy version in the Museum of Natural History at the University of Kansas, but the shot on the right is of a live horned rabbit. Now, it's not horns like what we picture the jackalope, but there's actually a papillomavirus that only affects rabbits and hares that make these hairy growths, very horn-like, grow out of their heads. And most of the time it affects their face. So this has a big horny growths coming out here. This one has a couple on the top of its head, but you can see where that could very well be looked at as a different species of rabbit. So this was from Mankato, Minnesota. There is actually a herd of horned rabbits that live in a park in Mankato, Minnesota. If you're lucky enough to find one, you can snap a photo of your very own real jackalope. I can't tell you how excited I was to find that out. It's like, you mean jackalopes are real? Do you know what this means? All of these other things that people laugh at you for believing in could actually be out there. So this is what keeps me looking for those kernels of truth, because you find the craziest one. Awesome. I was born in Texas, grew up in the Ozarks of Missouri to somebody who is from Missouri, but my father is from Minnesota. And so I had a grandparent set in the middle of Missouri by the world's largest 8-ball water tower around Tipton, and a set of grandparents that weren't too far from Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox. So whenever we'd go and see Grandma and Grandpa Nelson, we'd always stop by and see Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox. Now, how many of you are familiar with Paul and Babe? everybody knows Jackalopes, everybody knows Paul and Babe. So I'm getting these two that everybody know about out of the way early. But these guys are near and dear and close to my heart because as a half Minnesotan, half Texan, half Missourian, half Kansan, Paul and Babe were really important in my formative years. These grew out of the lumber industry. Okay, so Jackalope, Wild West, singing, cowboys, hunting, combining, new legends. This focuses mostly on the lumber industry. And he's actually kind of a new legend. So Jackalope was from about 1965. They officially noticed the jackalope as the official mascot of Douglas, Wyoming. 1916 is the first wide publication of Paul Bunyan's stories. Now, people kind of knew that bigger-than-life legend name, but it wasn't until the Red River Lumber Company started putting out pamphlets with the stories that those legends started becoming part of everybody's experience and really accessible. One of my favorites, and this is going to lead to a kernel of truth, which is going to be awesome. This is a scene of one of those legends about these lumberjacks are so big and have such an appetite that you need almost an army just to feed them. So any griddle worth its salt would have to be over a mile long, and to grease that griddle you would send people along with big slabs of fat on their feet so they could grease it up in a they would pour out of a large industrial kettle, and then to flip the flapjacks you almost have to go along on roller skates to keep up with the greasers and the pourers and the hungry lumberjacks eating these pancakes. So this is one of the legends that came out of that Red River Lumber Company set of pamphlets and illustrations about the Paul Bunyan legend, or how many axe swings it takes to clear a forest. He could do it in 2 or 3 if it's an average forest. Sometimes it might take 4 or 5, but not very often. And the great thing about Paul Bunyan is these grew out of real lumberjack stories. Some of the earliest collectors of these stories, there's one man named Eugene Shepard, who was a timber cruiser. And if you're a timber cruiser, your job is to go into the woods, see what trees are there, estimate how much they'll be worth, and that sets the price for logging off that section of timber. As a timber cruiser, he spent a lot of time with lumberjacks. Lumberjacks are usually crowded together in a longhouse and pretty bored, so they start telling stories. And if they start bragging about their feats of strength, at some point they'll have to prove it. And that doesn't do very good if you're a big bragger. So they started inventing this larger-than-life lumberjack to sort of tag all those stories on of, well, I can't fell a tree in 10 minutes, but Paul Bunyan could. So Eugene Shepard Simpson, who is listening to all these as a timber cruiser, starts compiling these and writing them down early on. And he helped out with the Red River Lumber Company promo materials. The first actual naming of Paul Bunyan was in 1904 in a very early article in Duluth. And this one talked a little bit about the year of the blue snow. And the men's shanty camp covered half a section. Mess camp was a stupendous affair, and it explained how that cooking utility started working to get, strapped 2 large hams to his feet and started running up and down a half-mile of black glistening stovetop. So even in 1904, these tall tales were starting to get published. And with the Red River Lumber Company, they started solidifying. Now this is where some of those kernels of truth start coming in. They're not located just in Minnesota. I mean, I always believe in Paul and Bunyan of the Minnesota ilk, but it's for any logging industry. So you'll find these Paul Bunyan things all the way along the upper, any logging industry. So you'll find them in Washington, you'll find them in Maine, you'll find them in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And at some point, I was in Washington State, looking at more world's largest things, because that's what I really like. I happened to be in Long Beach, Washington, where they have a world's largest skillet that's actually used. So during parade days, they let it down. They're a clamming industry, so they have an annual clam festival, and they make all of their clam queens ride in the big giant pan, bring it downtown, and then they fire it up and do a clam fry for everybody. When I happened to go see this big pan, it was just down the road from Winlock, Washington, home to the world's largest egg. When I was looking at the egg, it turns out that the pan had actually come over to the side of the world's largest egg, and they hired one of their models to skate around on the pan with bacon feet. So just like the Paul Bunyan legends, they strapped bacon to her feet, made her skate around in this pan so that they could create one of the world's largest omelets to feed the people of Winlock inside the world's largest frying pan. So it was like, oh, well, this is great. Another legend actually came true. They actually put pork products on somebody's feet and stuck her in a hot pan. That's awesome. And I ended up sticking around for the parade, and it turns out that this lady who traveled with the pan in the 1950s, she ended up being the, what did they call the lead in the parade? Grand Marshal? She ended up being the Grand Marshal of that year. So I asked her if that was really true, and she was like, you have no idea how great my feet smelled. Bacon feet, that's awesome. So I collect these stories because I look for these big iconic monuments. And as I told you before, the Paul and Babe in Bemidji are the closest to my heart because that's where my grandparents are. Paul Bunyan was made for the 1937 Carnival. Babe was made that year but was supposed to just be portable. So this is actually an embellished vehicle. This isn't a car stuck under Babe. They actually built that original Babe on a car chassis so it could move around in parades and shoot smoke out of its nose, and was an actual active oxen. Later on, they took out the car chassis, and these are still the Paul and Babe that stand beside Lake Bemidji today. And they've used this as a promo forever. Their forms haven't changed much. But there's also Paul Bunyan in Portland, Oregon, created in 1959 for their centennial. There's one in Bangor, Maine from 1959. There's a talking Paul in Brainerd from 1950. These Pauls are everywhere. But just as there are kernels of truth, there are kernels of falseness. How many of you have seen the movie Fargo? Yep. The Paul Bunyan in that one, fake. This is a scene from Fargo. They made that Paul Bunyan just for the movie. It didn't exist before this point. So it was up temporarily for this shot. They did the snow and then they took it down. But my cousin does fiberglass work, and he found it in a warehouse. And he said at that point, there were two bidders bidding for this particular fake Paul, even though he is real. He does actually exist. He's not actually associated with the town, but there was a bidding war between a Minnesotan and a Wisconsinite, and they're still kind of fighting over who gets Paul. And I mean, that's a border war you should explore too. There's another set in California, and they keep replacing their Paul and Babe. So 1961, 1952, and that leads us to the uncommon legends. We're still in the logging industry, talking a little bit about Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox, but one of the other titles in the lecture mentions the Hodag. How many of you have heard of a Hodag? Yeah?
Just barely.
Just barely. All right, this is one of those sneaky legends that I think the originator of this legend thought it would be bigger because his name, Eugene Simon Shepherd, remember I told you before, was a timber cruiser? His first excursion into the land of legend was talking about the Hodag. Because of his experience in the lumber camps, he knew that there were things in the woods that you couldn't always explain. And one of the big legends that the lumberjacks would talk about would be this evil spirit that lives in the North Woods, mostly around logging camps. The Hodag comes, like I said, comes from a logging industry, but he wasn't built up because they needed somebody for bigger stories. He built up because he's like the byproduct of another thing about logging camps. Babe the Blue Ox is the most famous blue ox for loggers, but most oxen were pretty abused and not revered. Babe the Blue Ox's handler is credited with inventing swearing. Swearing did not exist until he needed to actually get Babe to do something, and he could only do that by inventing swearing, and that would push Babe onwards. So Johnny Inkslinger, once he retired, started writing books and spread swearing out to mostly sailors and any other people who really needed that use of swear words to get something done a little faster. So swearing got invented by loggers. That part might not have a kernel of truth in it. But the truth is, loggers do swear a lot at their oxen. So this beast of burden, ends up being the thing that catches all of this hatred from the people driving it. They're also doing the hardest work. They're dragging trees through the forest, and it's a strenuous, strenuous life. Most oxen only live 7 years in the logging industry. So the lumberjacks believed that to cleanse this animal, once it passed away, it needed to be burned for 1 day more than the years that it lived. So if it lived for 7 years, you had to burn an ox's carcass for 8 days for it to actually be purified. And out of those ashes, that's where you get the hodag. And I accidentally kept calling it a hodog when I was researching, and they were like, oh no, that's a hodag. We don't have no hodogs up here, it's a hodag. So it's hodag, just so you know. And they're also pasties, not pasties, when you're asking for the fold over. Got that mistake too in a bakery. That lady was not happy when I asked to see her pasties. No, don't go there. So Eugene Simon Shepherd started telling the stories of the hodag, produced his first drawing in 1893. So 1904 was the first Paul Bunyan sighting in a newspaper. 1893, the hodag is older. This was really his first jab at creating this sort of, or illustrating the legend from where he was drawing and working. It appeared on October 28th in an issue of Rhinelander's New North. Eugene happened to own a resort in Rhinelander, and there are resorts all over the North Woods of Minnesota and Wisconsin. And to get people to come to your resort, you had to have something special. And he was a good storyteller. He knew that if people would just come to his resort, they would find something amazing, and they maybe would want to stay. So his resort had this really bizarre feature of scented moss that grew on all the trees. The moss there, if you just went up to it, you would get this beautiful, pleasant waft of, sometimes it was roses, sometimes it was lilac, sometimes it was violets, which was well maintained by his wife at night, who would sprinkle perfume on all of the moss growing, so that would be there for his visitors in the next morning. So he was a storyteller from early on, but he was the first one to start collecting the stories of the hodag. He even managed to capture one. He had a real hodag at the very first county fair in the county for Rhinelander in 1896. There is this tent right at the entrance that was low to the ground, and the hodag is mostly a nocturnal creature. So the way that they captured it is they had a rag on the end of a stick soaked in chloroform. They stuck it into the hole where they thought the hodag would be. This is kind of like noodling for anybody from Oklahoma. It's like noodling for hodags. Only the chloroform put him to sleep. They removed the hodag, got him to the county fair, and put him in this low tent and covered him over so that he would still feel a little safe and a little contained. So when you would pay your 5 cents to go see this hodag, 5 cents, 1896. That's an awful lot. When you would pay your 5 cents, it'd be a very dimly lit tent. You could barely see what was going on, but you could kind of smell this really horrible burnt ox flesh smell, and you could see these slightly glowing eyes, and you could see this steam that kind of smelled maybe a little bit like tea too, because they did use a tea kettle for that part. But just when you convinced yourself that it wasn't real, it would move, and you would run out of there as fast as you could, because if you're in the logging area, you would have heard these legends about the hodag by then. It did turn out that once he was invited to the Wisconsin State Fair to exhibit it there, they did find out that it was a little bit of a hoax, in that his sons were kind of making it move and boiling the water for the kettle for the steam and snort. But there was an actual physical hodag in that tent. He was carved from a tree stump covered with an oxen skin, which gave him that great, horrible smell. And I even have a hodag with me today, displayed pretty close. This is a juvenile hodag. It's a very small example. The real ones are close to 7 feet long and can jump, but this one I do keep in its own little dark tent. And he's pretty calm today, so that's pretty nice. But that's probably as close as I'm going to let you get to him, because you can't just show all the tricks. Now you can come up and check out the video. But that was sort of the idea. You give them a story and you give them a glimpse, and that's how you create a bigger legend. Now, the original hodag was sort of lost after those first 2 fair excursions, but Rhinelander grabbed onto this. They're like, you know what? This is ours. So they recreated one. This is a postcard that started being popular in the 1920s of the folks of Rhinelander illustrating that initial hodag capture, and they would sell this as postcards then. And even now, just like over in Douglas, Wyoming, Rhinelander, Wisconsin, very proudly claims the home of the hodag. For the 1932 50th anniversary, their medallion features this early legend. There's historic markers that talk about Eugene Shepard and his influence in the area. There's a giant hodag in front of the Chamber of Commerce. The police cars have hodags on them. The high school mascot is a very nice little fuzzy version, which is very sweet. So he did end up being this sort of great set of boosterism. And that's something that Eugene really was proud about in doing these legends. That's another good difference I kind of want to point out. There's a difference between a legend and a hoax. Hoaxes are designed to separate you from your money, and you usually feel taken afterwards. Legends, you kind of know that there might only be a kernel of truth and that most of it's going to be fabricated, but its goal isn't to make you feel dumb, it's to enhance the story that you might already know. And that might be a subtle designation, but Eugene was a master of not just the hoax, but turning the hoax into a legend that could actually be done for the greater good. And in one of the articles that he wrote for the paper was about boosterism and the invention of that hodag. And he said, the title of it was, "Long Live the Hodag." And he said in that pamphlet, "By no means is all the progress to be credited to the hodag, but the hodag did his bit. Not only hundreds, but thousands of people came to view the hodag, and not one of them went away without having learned a little bit more about northern Wisconsin. And it's safe to guess that each of those thousands told others what they'd seen and heard. In this way, the beauties, the opportunities, and the resources of northern Wisconsin spread, and many who came out of curiosity on that day have come to make their home with us. So long live the hodag." So a master of the hoax, a master of the legends. The Chamber of Commerce still lets people know what a hodag is. They've expanded some of their legends with the hodag, like when the wind blows through the hodag's fur, it plays a perfect version of the beer barrel polka. Or the hodag smells exactly like pine-scented car freshener. So anytime you might smell one of those, there might be a hodag nearby. Or timeline-wise, hodag discovered 1893. Hodag was the third string center for the Green Bay Packers during the Ice Bowl in 1967. Hodag raised the prize-winning milking goat in the 2009 Wisconsin State Fair. So they're still having fun with it up in Rhinelander. Now, I've talked a lot about the West. I've talked a lot about the logging industry. What about Kansas? What have we got? Did you know we have our own tall tale legend? How many of you have heard of Johnny Caw? And this is so sad. You two look familiar. Have I talked to you two before? Are you ringers? Dodge City talk? No. All right. Okay. I found out we have our own set of legends specific to Kansas. And I was actually doing a lecture about roadside monuments throughout Kansas, in Manhattan, Kansas, and they were like, "Oh, well, have you gone to go see the big Johnny Caw statue at the city park?" What? I'd never even seen it. It was right there under my nose countless times. I had to go look for our own larger-than-life legend, and the story behind it is also one of those ways that legends can be built but also need to be put in context. It turns out Johnny Caw was discovered or rediscovered during the centennial when a group of boosters decided people were not proud enough of Kansas. We didn't have that big, larger-than-life guy to pin our stories on. They needed to figure out why. So a group of people came together to start publishing stories about Johnny Call, kind of like what Eugene Shepard did in Rhinelander. Put the stories out there first, but then have this touchstone icon. And so in the weekly paper, they started putting out stories of Johnny Caw. And one of the very first stories was putting him in context and letting you know why you might not have ever heard of him. Anyone around the steel mills in Pennsylvania can tell you about Joe McGark, the steel worker, who stirred molten steel with his bare arm and made railroad rails by squeezing hot iron with his hands. And surely you've read of the Irish civil engineer Finn McCool, who dug the Grand Canyon. Then there was Paul Bunyan, the big lumberjack who could chop down 20 or 30 trees before breakfast and move them with his big blue ox. Paul is said to have logged off the Dakotas and Kansas in the early days, and one authority even credits Paul Bunyan with keeping Kansas dry by logging off all of the whiskey trees. But have you noticed there's not one real farmer on that list? You might ask why. The answer is simple. Farmers are by nature modest and do not publicize their outstanding feats. For instance, Johnny Caw, the great wheat farmer of Kansas, kept his exploits to himself. Since he never bragged about himself and Kansans are not wont to show off, no one has taken the trouble to tell the rest of the world about Johnny Caw. He's always been accepted as a great pioneer and just taken for granted. But now that Kansas has attained the mature age of 100, Johnny Caw should be recognized because he was representative of the spirit of Kansas. So here, George Fillinger, he was the one who started writing these legends and putting the stories out there. He very swiftly and very easily explains, put him in context, and also explains why you might not have heard of this great, great farmer. A lot of the stories are similar. Again, there's pancakes, talking about how many pancakes Johnny Caw would have to eat to keep his energies up during the horrible wheat harvest. But there's also things that put him into the Kansas context. Paul Bunyan never had to deal with tornadoes. He wouldn't know what to do. But Johnny Caw would just whip off the end of any sort of tornado, cut off their spout, and they would harmlessly float away. And might have been a little bit responsible for some of the Dust Bowl era, but a little dust is better than a bunch of tornadoes. And Johnny Caw was responsible for keeping those under control. And to go along with these legends, they decided to erect a statue of Johnny Caw there in the city park so that everybody would remember that we too have our set of legends. Now the down part about this legend, to put him in further context, there's a fight scene. One day Paul Bunyan came down to see the land he had lumbered off before and see if it needed lumbering again. He was surprised to see the broad fields of golden grain. He walked around in awe, but in doing so he trampled a whole set of what Johnny had just planted. Johnny caught up to Paul somewhere in the area known as the Flint Hills, and the fight was on. They dug their heels into the ground, and that's what made the Flint Hills. They scraped and skidded their boots along the tributaries, and that's where the water flows even today. The fight lasted over 13 days throughout Kansas, southwest Missouri, and the Ozarks of Arkansas, forming most of those. On Friday of the 13th day, Johnny was found sitting on top of Paul with one hand holding each end of the giant forester's handlebar mustache. Like Samson of old, who lost his strength when his hair was shorn, Paul gave up when his mustache was twisted right off. Johnny let him go when he promised never to return to Kansas, and that's also why Friday the 13th is unlucky to this day. So it was a wonderful set of stories that continue on about Kansas history, but in a fun context. And there's a new reprint that's out now that has illustrations of that fight. It's the part that I didn't read to you. They said that the Mississippi was carved when Johnny Caw actually didn't just let Paul go, but pushed him back up north, and that formed not just the Mississippi River, but formed the rocks at the headwaters, where it was from Paul Bunyan's nose being pushed up north. So the original was produced for the Kansas Centennial, but there's this nice new little one that I found at, I think, Kansas Originals, so one of the bookstores that just focuses on Kansas lore. So even in a state that you love and that you feel like you've explored all the nooks and crannies of, there are more legends out there that people have already put together to remind you of where you live and some of the great stories that come out of it. And I like to end this with one of the quotes from George Fillinger as to, similar to what Eugene Shepard said about the Hodag, about why they felt the need to have this big, great Kansas farmer. Who were our pioneers? They were our great-grandparents, our grandparents, and our parents. They were our great-grandparents, our great-great-grandparents, and the grandparents of our great-great-grandparents' parents. Because all of this would be impossible to name every single one of these early settlers, Johnny Caw was created as the embodiment of that pioneer spirit. When some good thing needs to be done, he said, let us do it. Would that we would return to Johnny Caw's ideals. Who else but us? Who else in the U.S. but us? The energy, the money, now spent on strikes, riots, mob violence, marches, demonstrations, insurrections, properly channeled, would go a long way to correct social evils, real and imaginary injustices. Creation, not destruction, will advance society. Johnny Caw said, U.S. citizenship affords many privileges, but also demands individual responsibilities. So, in this creation of the legend, they also created a model to make your own legends about the place that you live and work and enjoy. And also a little bit of a permission to have that kernel of truth, have that idea of why. Feel free to embellish, because what's life without some embellishments? So those were 4 quick legends from the road. What are some of the legends that come from this area that you maybe have heard, maybe haven't? Or what would be a legend that could grow out of this area? We've got, we're close to the world's largest hand-dug well, so there's a lot of ground-dwelling possibilities. We do have Johnny Caw, but we're also entering into the West. So what happens whenever some of those Western influences start coming into the Great Plains? What are some of the legends that you remember growing up only halfway and could embellish and bring back to life once again? Any questions about what you've seen and heard? Do you need to ask what's true and what's not, or are you okay with having embellishments?
Was Mr. Lyre's first name pronounced with a long A rather than the short A?
What did I say?
You said Adam.
See, that was the catch. He was a damn liar. I can say that because it's a name. See, and that's awesome. When you write it cleverly enough, you can discover more and more things. Nice. Yeah, this one was issued on June 31st, between sunrise and sunset only. Yes, he was a damn liar. Questions, comments? All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to Community College for having me out today. This is a good way to revisit the area, and looking forward to having another great drive-around day. Maybe run into a jackalope.
Thank you.